So sometimes, especially in the creativity literature, you've got what's called the beginner's mind, where this is an individual who can walk into a space and see things afresh and and that's an important perspective at times. That's a really important. They can say, why? Why do we do it this way? It's almost like being a 5-year-old, right? Sometimes I had to look at my kids and say, yes, it just does not make sense that this is how we do it, right? Great observation. So if we're not creating that place where that conversation can occur, people are afraid, there isn't that psychological safety, then we're going to stay quiet. If we stay quiet, you as the leader now are kind of out on your own, making a decision, and you're missing a lot of information. And then that's a dangerous place to be. So I always talk about the need for that psychological safety. And again, there's norms around this where I might not get my way, you might not get your way. We're ultimately going to decide what we think is the best guess, the next experiment we're going to run that collectively we think has the best shot. But none of us know, quote unquote, what needs to be done in this situation. And that person who thinks that they always do, I think it's not sustainable. I think they're setting themselves up for a loss at some point.
Did you know there are 180 cognitive biases? I didn't, and it's just one of the many things that I learned from recording this episode with today's guest, Scott J. Allen. Scott is a PhD and leadership development consultant. He's an instructor, speaker, author, and a fellow podcaster as well. Today, we'll be covering some key leadership topics, such as the role of the leader, stages of development, the part innovation has to play in building and maintaining high-performing teams. We talk about culture and what it means. We talk about those cognitive biases and other related issues like the difference between confidence and arrogance. It's a wide-ranging but thoroughly enjoyable conversation. I hope you're going to find it as educational as I did, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy listening to Scott as well.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Scott, welcome to Leading with Integrity. It's great having you on the show. Appreciate your early start as well from across the pond. So, yeah, it's great having you here.
You know what? It's wonderful to be with you, David. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. I'm looking forward to the conversation today. And like we were talking about before we got on air, I was just in your neck of the woods, so to speak, and just had a magical 2 weeks with family. So difficult at times, but overall, absolutely just magical. Not because of England or because of the UK, just because of family.
Yeah, I'm sure the countryside didn't hurt, though. Yeah.
Oh, you know what, though? What was so interesting about that, David, was the hedgerows. So we got to Dartmoor, and it's, essentially a one-lane road with hedges and I'm in a rental car driving on the different side of the road. So it was a good opportunity for me to practice emotional intelligence, and everything was beeping at me. And my wife was saying, you're too close on this side. And so it was, I was in my own simulator to practice emotional intelligence. And sometimes the hedgerows won.
Yeah, about half the time in my experience, but yeah, let's not say much more about that.
Oh,
yeah.
Lovely. Absolutely lovely.
Great. Well, I'm pleased to hear it. Yeah. All right. Well, we're going to dive in at the deep end, really. Dive. I'm going to push you in. No, I'm not really. It's over to you for a little while to, I guess, give us a bit of background about you, your career so far, what you do today, and why you do it, really.
Well, I was a diver growing up, so I like the deep end.
So, yes, pleased to hear it. Yeah.
Yes. And of course, you all have an incredible diver, Tom Daly, just absolutely amazing talent. So, gosh, okay, 17 years in higher education as a professor of management. And this is the first fall in 17 years where I haven't gone, quote unquote, back to school. I've transitioned out of higher education and again, teaching MBAs, primarily leadership and management skills. And over the years had started building a practice of my own and really engaging with people doing the work, and have absolutely loved that work. So I've been doing a lot of client work in Northeast Ohio, which is where I am located, in healthcare or construction or architecture, banking and finance. I mean, just really nonprofit across the domain. And that's really become kind of my place of passion right now, is working with individuals who have the challenge right now, immediately in front of them. And can I serve as a thinking partner to help them think through their options, the potential next experiment that they could run. And so my passion is, how do we better prepare these individuals to be successful when serving in these really challenging roles? Leading with integrity is one piece of that. That's the foundation. That's what's going to keep things sustainable. And then there's just so much more. And so I love the puzzle. I've spent almost 20 years writing about leader development and researching leader development. So this conversation that we're having, I love it. It's in my wheelhouse, and I have endless amounts of energy for it.
Well, me too. That's why we're here. Yeah, I love that phrase as well, thinking partner. That is a great way of describing, well, coaching, mentoring, all of the above, really. But yeah, that is really what it is. It's very descriptive. I love it.
It is, because oftentimes when you're thinking through some of these challenges, there aren't quote unquote answers. There's a gentleman from your neck of the woods. He's in Wales. Dave Snowden wrote a famous Harvard Business Review article with Mary Boone. And it was called A Leader's Framework for Decision Making. It's a Harvard Business Review article. But they kind of classify different types of problems. You've got simple problems, complicated problems, complex problems, chaotic problems. And they've changed the phrasing over the years. But in general, there's problems with answers. There's problems with answers that we're going to need to get to an expert to know. There's problems that don't have answers. We're going to have to experiment. And then, of course, in a chaotic kind of context, we're just trying to get order back to a place of order. And so a lot of the individuals that I'm working with right now are living in that space of complexity. And again, there aren't clear-cut answers. It's more about, what's the next experiment we're going to run? How are we going to think about creating a space where we can have the discussion as a team, like an authentic, real discussion with the psychological safety that we need so that people feel like they can voice their opinions, and some norms so that we say, look, I might not get my way, you might not get your way, but we're going to come up with the best path forward. And that's our next experiment. And in complexity, that's, in my opinion, kind of the work. So that thinking partner, yes, because I can't look at someone and say, this is the answer. You do these 3 things and you have a high functioning team. Ta-da! It's not a thing, right?
Pours a bit of water on one of the later questions, doesn't it? If there is no easy answer. But yeah, anyway, I was expecting you to have one. I read a bit about your profile and went on your website a couple of times, and I noticed a recurring theme in terms of quotes that you like to talk about. Now, one of those that really stuck out to me was this quote, "Who you are is how you lead." So what does that quote mean to you? And then maybe we can talk about some of the other concepts that surround it as well afterwards.
Yeah. That quote sticks with me in a really, really powerful way. And Bob Hogan, and the founder of Hogan Assessments, is credited with saying that. But for me, there's a whole world underneath that quote. And so again, back to one of your passions, integrity. Who you are is how you lead. Are you a person of integrity? Tell me about your character. Do you model the way? Do you walk the talk, so to speak? And that's part of who you are. And if you have a strong person of character, if you have integrity, well, then yes. If not, well, that's what shows up to the team. So that's who you are. And there's a whole world underneath this quote, which is fascinating to me, because it's your values, it's your character, it's your personality. So your level of optimism. You've worked with that person somewhere along the way where every day was a little bit 50 and rainy, right? How you doing? Crappy. Okay, well, have a good day. That's who they were. And that's what showed up to the team. And you put that person in a position of authority, and absolutely it can be a pretty rough place from a culture standpoint. Or maybe it's an individual's other aspects of personality, like a leader's level of conscientiousness or extroversion. I mean, all of that stuff kind of shows up. The person's maturity level. Again, you put someone who lacks maturity in a position of authority, and it can get pretty interesting pretty fast, and it can get pretty toxic pretty fast. So this who you are, and one thing, David, that I love about that quote also is this is your knowledge about the activity of leading. This is your skill level. Those are all part of who you are. But one reason I love the quote also, and where it really hits home for me is, I think you could put a different word at the end of that phrase. Who you are is how you parent. Who you are is how you coach. Who you are is how you teach. If you're a priest, who you are is how you minister. And if you're in a position of authority, who you are matters greatly. And so Carol Dweck of Mindset fame, she has this quote that I absolutely love: becoming is better than being. And so I think if we are in a position of authority, and again, that could be parent, that could be leader or manager, however we want to construct it, coach, teacher, are you becoming a better version of yourself always? And really engaging in that work, because if others are in your care, hopefully you're the best version of yourself. And I think we owe that to the people under our care, in our care, because we all know what it feels like when your supervisor, your parent, maybe isn't in the best place. And that's a hard place to be. So that quote, who you are is how you lead. So who are you? And what's the good, bad, and ugly of that? Maybe under stress, you tend to lash out, shut down. Maybe you become a little tornadic in your behavior and get all worked up. Well, that's who you are. And that impacts others, right? I mean, it's fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, the word that immediately comes to mind is authenticity, isn't it? But I think integrity is obviously very relevant too. It kind of strikes me from two sort of areas. One is the one we've very much spoken about, and the other is kind of that self-awareness angle and understanding who you are before you try to lead. I think that is so important, and it's something that a lot of people skip over for various reasons. Not least is the which of how you even get a management role in the first place. Quite often it's thrust upon you because it's the only option. If you want more money anyway. And so I think there is that really interesting piece around the sort of the self-reflective side of this question and knowing yourself before you then go and lead. Because if you don't know yourself, then you don't know what kind of leader you're going to become. You don't know what the potential impact of your leadership is going to be on others. And if you haven't thought that through, you're probably, in the nicest possible way, you're not taking that responsibility seriously enough.
Exactly. And so I think, yes, that's another great framing. So if you lack self-awareness, or reflection is a habit of mind, is not something you engage in, well, that shows up to the team, and that's who you are. And again, I think you can get to some pretty rough places if that's who you are. A person who doesn't reflect, doesn't own the mistake, doesn't really, really engage in that activity of self-awareness, of looking within. You're exactly right. 100%.
I think beyond that as well, it's a question of whether you can lean into your strengths and mitigate your weaknesses and all those normal things that, again, not restricted to leadership, of course.
Mm-hmm. Oh, of course. Yeah, for sure. And again, that self-awareness piece helps us reflect on some of our areas of growth or development, helps us reflect on what are our strengths. And I think the mature individual is going to say, look, I'm not the most detail-oriented person. I need someone on the team who has that skill. Or my strength is not necessarily strategy. We need someone on the team. But if I am lacking maturity, lacking confidence, if that's who I am, and I want to be the center, well, then I shun those people away because now they're the competition. That's who I am. And that's too bad.
Goes some way to explain why so many teams get stuck though, doesn't it? Because that natural tendency to not, push them away, as you say, people who maybe have the opposite skill set to you because you're not comfortable with that. Whereas, again, as you said, it's having the maturity to recognize the strengths in others as well as the weakness in yourself. And then, opposites attract, I guess is the phrase, isn't it? But that doesn't apply here.
Well, there's a really, it can be definitely it can be opposites attract, because so I might prefer extroversion Well, do I have someone on the team who is a little bit more reflective in the moment and sits back and really observes? That can be a strength. Or if we go to Myers-Briggs type indicator, for instance, is just one difference. It could be that I am a little more planning. That would be the judging dimension, and a little bit more locked in. And maybe someone on the team is a little bit more go with the flow and stays open to possibilities and is very, very comfortable with changing things at the last moment because the context requires that. Those differences definitely can be a strength if I'm mature and can handle sharing the spotlight. And so there's this really cool line of research, David, right now that is really exploring the intersection of leadership and the adult development literature. So this really gets into that word maturity, and I'm not going to get into the details of it here unless you want to, because we totally can. I can geek out on this, but generally speaking, just like children, there's different developmental levels. And if you put a person in a leadership position and they're at one of those lower levels of development where really the focus is me, what I get out of it, what's in it for me, how do I win? That's really the worldview this individual has. And oftentimes it's a person who's in their late teens, early 20s, and then we mature out of that oftentimes. A certain percentage of the population doesn't. And you put that person in a position of leadership and it's all about them. It's all about them winning. It's all about them protecting their fiefdom. And that can be tragic for the team.
It certainly can. How high is that percentage, out of curiosity? Do you know?
Well, according to Robert Keegan, he's at Harvard, and I'm doing this off the top of my head right now, but it's about 6 to 8% of adults stay in what would be his level 2 or stage 2. Now, stage 3 is called the socialized mind. This is going to be the largest percentage of the population. So imagine that you have an individual who grew up Protestant and a fan of the Labor Party. And in their household, it was Labor and Protestant. And that's called the socialized mind. So I've been socialized into this certain set of beliefs. Well, oftentimes adults will move from socialized mind to what's called self-authoring, which is, I like the Labor Party for this. And, or in the United States, in the context of the United States, Democrats are correct about this, but maybe Republicans are correct about this, or I really like this from Buddhism. They can kind of self-author their own perspective on the world and kind of take bits and pieces and make sense on their own. The socialized mind will just almost at times become dogmatic for just that approach. And again, that can be a difficult place to be when we're trying to collaborate with others. If I'm staunchly rigid in my perspective, I've been socialized into the belief that Catholicism is the correct approach. You are wrong. This is right. And that can be a difficult place to work from as well when it comes to collaboration. And it's a fascinating intersection of literature, the adult development literature and leadership. And of course, you can kind of see where this is going. The theory is that the more mature an individual is, the more they're going to be able to hold a lot of different competing commitments, differing perspectives, and hopefully bring some of those folks together versus dogmatically separate or divide, or only focus on what's in it for me and how do I win.
It does sound fascinating, and you're going to have to send me some articles to read afterwards.
I will.
Yeah, please do. So the other connection there that has sparked in my mind, probably because I literally just recorded an episode about this last week, I was talking to someone who is an expert in ethics. So we were talking about the differences between like rules-based approaches to ethics and morality, and whether ethics actually should be a bit more relative and contextual. And that there seems to be a parallel there as well. When you talk about the dogmatic individual, that's the rules-based ethics approach, isn't it, I guess?
I think when it comes to this cognitive development, yes, an individual is going to construct the concept of character or integrity or values. They will shift depending on the developmental level that this person sees the world from. And I love that conversation, mostly because it just has very real ramifications for the people under that person's care. Does that make sense?
Absolutely does. Yeah. It's Yeah, I mean, we can probably think of half a dozen examples off the top of our head, can't we, of the impact that would have in a day to day. Like if there is an absolute right or wrong way of doing this, for example, you
Yes,
reduce that down to just a daily work practice. Suddenly, you're making everyone's life harder because they've got to do the exact way you've prescribed, because that's the way you've always done it.
Yep.
Even though probably at least half of them will have already thought of a better way, a quicker way, more efficient way of doing it.
exactly. And now if I am creating a space where I have the answer, this is how we do it, this is the process, then that's shutting down voice in the team. There isn't that psychological safety for people to raise their hand and say, hey, have you seen this? And we all suffer from probably, there's a beautiful visual, David, I think it's 180 cognitive biases that they've discovered. So
Wow.
this is the realm of Daniel Kahneman and some other folks who've really spent their whole careers studying cognitive biases. 180. So whether it's inattentional bias or self-serving bias, expert bias, those all limit our ability to make sense of the world and think about creative ways to solve problems. So sometimes, especially in the creativity literature, you've got what's called the beginner's mind, where this is an individual who can walk into a space and see things afresh and and that's an important perspective at times. That's a really important. They can say, why do we do it this way? It's almost like being a 5-year-old, right? Sometimes I had to look at my kids and say, yes, it just does not make sense that this is how we do it, right? Great observation. So if we're not creating that place where that conversation can occur, people are afraid, there isn't that psychological safety, then we're going to stay quiet. If we stay quiet, you as the leader now are kind of out on your own, making a decision, and you're missing a lot of information. And then that's a dangerous place to be. So I always talk about the need for that psychological safety. And again, there's norms around this where I might not get my way, you might not get your way. We're ultimately going to decide what we think is the best guess, the next experiment we're going to run that collectively we think has the best shot. But none of us know, quote unquote, what needs to be done in this situation. And that person who thinks that they always do, I think it's not sustainable. I think they're setting themselves up for a loss at some point, a big loss at some point, because they're going to miss something. The cognitive biases are constantly working us all day long, and we need others to help us move past some of those.
Yeah, agreed. I think this whole idea of having to have all the answers, having to always know best. I mean, it's on the one hand, like if you are that sort of person, I can only admire that level of confidence. On the other hand, usually it's not so much confidence as it is arrogance.
Yeah, and there's a balance there, right? I mean, I think there's a you don't want to be so wishy-washy that you're always asking the team what we need to do.
Right.
But also for some of these, so oftentimes when I'm working with teams, I'll say, look, are you elevating the right questions for the team to work? As a leader, you have 1,000 questions. There's all kinds of things that I don't have an answer to. And to your point, I think it's a beautiful one. Sometimes people construct in their minds the role of leader. It's synonymous with the person who has the answers. So that's a ton of pressure to put on yourself because some of these things don't have answers. And you can't possibly, quote unquote, know exactly what needs to be done next. So I think there's a humble confidence. There's a balance there of I'm confident in what I've accomplished and that we can come up with a great path forward. But I'm humble enough to know when I'm a little outside of my purview here or of my expertise, and we need to get others to work this specific problem. It's the right one. It's important. It's critical. And we need some other perspectives. There's a great scene in Apollo 13, the film, where Gene Kranz, the head of mission control, they're trying to figure out how to get the men home. And this is an example of a complex problem. It's not something they had scenario planned. So they're in the room and he looks at the group and he says, how do we get our people home? He didn't have the answer, but he created a place where they could co-create what they thought their best guess was moving forward. And, thankfully they got them home in that instance. But it's a great example of them kind of having the knockdown, drag out conversation in the room and coming up with their best guess. Thankfully, it worked out in that instance. Boeing right now has a couple astronauts up on the space station. And they haven't, I think Elon Musk is, at least that's the latest word, that he's sending something up to the space station to get them home. So they're in a different situation. But it's so interesting.
Yeah, I was just reading about that yesterday as well. I follow Chris Hadfield, the Canadian astronaut who spent a while up there, largely because I loved his book, and there's a great leadership quote in there that's way too long for me to remember off by heart and repeat right now, but it is a great quote. But yeah, so he was posting that. It looks like they're not going to be home till next year at the earliest, and it's a nightmare.
2025, February is what I read, but I haven't followed the astronaut you're speaking of, but I'm interested in that because, to get an insider's perspective on that, oof.
he was the Space Oddity guy, the guy with the guitar. He did a lot of the videos. He was, while he was up there, he went, exploded on social media.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen it, so I'm going to look him up.
Yeah, no, he's good. I'll send you a link afterwards as well. It's an interesting one. I do love the Apollo 13, the film as well. That moment where they just walk in with that box full of stuff and just pour it on the table and say, right, this is everything they've got. Make the solution with this. It reminded me of like one of those random challenges or the quiz TV programs and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that scene is a round peg in a square hole or something.
Yeah.
Like, we need this to fit into this, using only this.
Yeah. I mean, the ingenuity though, you've got to admire it.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. I feel like it'd be a much different story if it hadn't worked out, but thankfully it did. So.
Exactly. Right. Oof.
Yeah. Anyway, so I mean that whole thing around the leader being expected to know all the answers. So often, I think that's a problem or a myth of their own creation, isn't it? Like, it's only in your head. Most of the people you're leading, they know full well you're still human, and they're not necessarily expecting you to have the answers all the time. Yep. And I feel like you're absolutely right. It's just about asking the right questions in the right way at the right time.
Exactly.
And then ultimately making the decision when no one else can.
Exactly. And again, part of the norms might be, look, I'm going to make decisions that the group disagrees with at times, and I'll take ownership of that. But yes, when we're switching into this place of complexity and there's no person in the world we can call to say, hey, how do I build a high functioning team? Can you tell me the 3 things I need to do with Peter, Steve, Janet, and Kelly? Anyone who says, oh, just do these 3 things and you'll be all set is selling you snake oil. It's not something people can give you considerations. You could explore some best practices, but there's no truth that those best practices will work in your context. There's an infinite number of variables between you and those 5 people that may or may not work. So you're experimenting and you're co-creating that with those individuals. And I think sometimes when I'm working with leaders and they say, well, how do I build this? How do I turn this into a high functioning team? One consideration is to say that to the team. How are we going to become a high functioning team? What are we going to do? Let's do this. And ultimately you're co-creating with them. But it is a paradigm shift from constructing leader as the person in charge and with the answers to leader as the person who's elevating the right questions and facilitating the conversation, and then working towards what's the next experiment we run and what's the best guess that we have. Anyone who approaches it differently, especially when working in that complexity, I think is limiting themselves and shutting themselves off from potentially coming up with at least the best guess, because they're just kind of hanging out there. You've been in that meeting where everyone disagreed with the direction that the authority figure was suggesting. No one said anything. Everyone talked afterwards about how terrible this decision was, but that leader's hanging out there because no one felt safe to say, you know what, I just respectfully would suggest that we also consider this, or that this potential downside is an important consideration for us right now. No one had the guts to say that, or the environment wasn't such that we felt like we could say that. That leader is now hanging out there, and it's probably not a solution that's going to be all that successful.
Yeah, definitely been in that meeting. Also been in a few where literally everyone said, no, that's the wrong idea. We should do this instead.
Good.
Would have been good if it resulted in that outcome, but it didn't. Anyway, but that's more about that individual leader, I suspect.
Exactly.
I don't know. I mean, it brings to mind that old cliche, doesn't it? About, compromise just means everyone's equally unhappy. I'm not even sure I like that idea either.
No. Yeah. And so I think what we're getting at here is that there's these tensions. And I did some work once. This is going to feel like a little bit of a turn, but even your question a little bit ago about ethics, or I think leadership styles, or how we approach making a decision. I did some work with an organization a few years ago that was their speakers went on tour with the world's biggest acts: Jay-Z, Rihanna, Neil Young, The Who, from your neck of the woods. And they had this storeroom of speakers, and the soundboards would also go out on the road. So you had these sound engineers that would go out and work these soundboards. Well, depending on the arena or the outdoor facility that they were in, or the amphitheater or the theater, the sound engineer would have to adjust the dials to get the greatest level of sound, to really, really, and it was never the dials were never the same. They had to have the expertise to know we got to turn this up to 6, we got to turn this up to 4, in a very simplistic way, the treble or the bass. But of course, they have a soundboard with hundreds of things that they're adjusting to get the best sound for that context. I think leadership is a similar thing. Am I aware of some of the dials I need to be turning? When do I need to be a little bit more authoritative and confident in that this is the path forward and inspire a shared vision using me? And when do I need to slow down, pause, ask the team? And am I consciously adjusting those dials because, that's what's required? The context is different in every situation we're in. And depending on the context, it's likely going to change the levels to produce the best sound. That makes sense?
It does. It's not a terrible metaphor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, from an ethics standpoint, that's an interesting conversation too that we could go down, because as a leader of a country, so to speak, you are constantly placed in no-win scenarios, no-win situations where I might make a decision and now a certain percentage of individuals statistically will probably slip into poverty, or we have these homeless population in the United States and we're going to clamp down and put them in jail. Well, there's really interesting, very, very interesting perspectives that you can explore and the ramifications of some of your decisions. So you can go to like a Harry Truman in World War II, horrible decisions that he's making, horrible, terrible decisions. So ethics is also one where it's, am I going to make a decision that is actually going to do harm to a faction of people, yet benefit a larger number of people? Well, what's the more difficult of these decisions? And so sometimes these individuals are put in these really terrible situations that they have to lead through, right? When we were in the UK, we were in Churchill's war room. And think about what that man, from an ethics standpoint, struggled with each and every day, making decisions where we knew a certain number of British soldiers would die, and we are now making a larger decision to hopefully gain some type of momentum in the larger picture. Horrible decisions that they're placed to.
Yeah. I mean, those are the extremes.
100%, yes.
But I think, there's a lot of the principles there, aren't there? And I wonder, when things aren't that extreme, how much thought people put into those potential outcomes versus just, I think this is the right one, I'm going to do this, and that's the end of discussion sort of thing. And I wonder, without getting sort of into that crippling indecision spiral, I wonder how much more thought could or should be put into things before a decision is made. Because again, it's another side of that coin, of that myth of what leadership is about, isn't it? That decisive means pick an option quickly.
Yes.
Which I don't think that's necessarily right. I think it's more pick an option, but with some basis.
Yeah. Well, that's another one of those dials, like time.
Yeah, true.
Do we give this a little more time, or is this something we can decide relatively quickly? I think in the day-to-day normal where I hear it most often is things like layoffs.
Mm.
And, we're going to cut 5% of the workforce. And some leaders make that decision very readily, and it's just business. And other leaders that I've worked with do everything they can to save those jobs or to help protect that. And to your point, which I love, is someone at least pausing, slowing down, and again, creating that environment where we can look at this from a number of angles so that we're making the best decision. Because as you know, that has very real ramifications for culture on either end.
I think that's one of those, that dial I feel should be linked directly to the level of impact. Like the lower the potential impact, the quicker you make the decision, and vice versa. But yeah, I mean, the layoffs thing, I think we've probably both seen way too many leaders who, yeah, as you say, it's just click their fingers, right, I've made that decision, we're going to get rid of 500 people or 10 people or whatever. Maybe they've put a lot of thought into it, maybe they've agonized for weeks before then and we just didn't see it. But it doesn't give that impression when they just say, right, we're losing these people now. It's a business decision. I've made it. I'm the leader. That's my role. And again, I feel that's missing part of the point.
100%. 100%. And you have stories of individuals, yes, famously, who that was just how business is done. And you know what? That's the cost of doing business. And then you have leaders who, even stories through the pandemic of, we held on to everybody. We figured out a way to make that happen. We took a pay cut. We went to a 4-day work week. Again, you have wonderful, heroic stories in some ways. And again, sometimes leaders are placed in very difficult situations where actually we're going to have to cut 2%, and that has to happen. But I love your phrasing of, and your kind of consideration of time becomes really important. Are we giving this the time, and are we giving this the very thoughtful consideration before we just make these decisions? And again, you know what it feels like, or you know what it looks like when someone makes this decision and how that damages culture long term. Just think about what that does in the trust that people have in the organization. You go to the Gallup numbers about engagement, and there's very, very real ramifications for those decisions.
Absolutely. And I think that the real challenge of it is those ramifications can come with either side of that decision, can't they? So you hold on to people too long, or you hold on to the wrong people too long, damaging your culture. And you might feel like you're that heroic leader who's saving jobs, but actually you're destroying your culture in the process. And then equally, like, you get rid of people at the first chance. And I think the COVID years have really demonstrated this one as well. People remember that.
Yes.
It will get into the job market. People will hear this about your company, and so they won't want to come and work for you. And so give it a few years and suddenly you're one of these people saying, oh, it's really hard to find talent. Yeah, because they've heard you lay them off at a drop of a hat, so they don't want to come and work for you.
Yeah. And your culture is toxic, and you don't truly build relationships with individuals. You use them for 6 months and then let them go readily at the drop of a hat. Yes. And I really, really appreciate the dimension that you're bringing in on the other side of this, which is those individuals who at the other extreme are not getting rid of anybody, retaining people who are underperforming, and struggle to make the difficult decisions at times. And so you can turn the dial all the way to the other extreme, and that's not helpful. So how do you know? At times I'm with leaders and they say, well, how do I know what's the right move? Well, you don't. This is complexity. And hopefully you have a team of people you can ask that question to. Is this the right time? Are these the right people that we probably should part ways with? And which should we really work to retain from a cultural perspective? And you're giving these very, very important cultural questions the time they deserve. And you have a team of people who will voice their perspective. Again, they might not totally agree with the ultimate decision, but they know that you value their perspective.
I think generally speaking, it's what you were saying earlier, isn't it? It's you make the best decision you can, the best estimate you can with what you know now. And I think if there's one exception to that, it might be this question about layoffs, because that feels fairly permanent, doesn't it? But with anything else, it's best decision you can until you have further information. And if you have to change that decision, that's okay as long as you know why. Which, hence why I say maybe it doesn't apply to layoffs, because you can't. I guess you could rehire them if you separate in the right way, possibly, but I think that's not the way most people do it.
Well, exactly, not in the right way. And so, yes, I mean, I think that's a very, very important. You have these boomerangs where you have individuals who have left an organization and they come back. But I mean, and I had a former colleague who wrote about this. I mean, how are you separating from the institution? And are you doing that well so that people generally leave with a good taste in their mouth about the organization? And again, that's in quotes, right? Because there's a separation going on. But is it humane? Is it caring? Is it explained the best that it can be? And do I leave the door open? In the future, we would love to have you back, and, we'll reach out when and if that opportunity. And again, you leave that door open. That doesn't mean that person's going to come back, or maybe that person is going to not reciprocate that care, but at least you've tried, and you've tried to separate well and in a healthy way and in a mature way. And I think that's the best you can do in that situation, to give it that thought, be conscientiousness, right? Are you conscientiously respecting this other human? And if you're treating them in a humane way, that makes a difference than if it's done how we hear it happen in other ways, which is not humane.
Yeah, I mean, there's that recent one, wasn't there? Was it this year or late last year? The CEO who sacked like a few hundred people over a Zoom call, and they didn't know what was going to happen. And it was like a 15-minute broadcast to everyone at once. You're all sacked, kind of.
Bad way.
Yeah, that would be the not way. Yeah, the wrong way to do it. So I think this kind of leads us into another question that I'd love to get into, actually. So we've been talking about culture, and we've got some great examples there of how not to build a good culture. So it makes me think of one of these other quotes that I know you love, the leaders create the weather. And obviously, with weather becomes climate. Climate is basically the culture, isn't it? It's a nice metaphor. I like it. So why do you think that is such an important concept for leaders to grasp? And what can they actually do? And accepting it's a long-term process to create the right culture for their teams.
This is my friend Jonathan Reams. He's at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. And he said this, and it's one of those quotes that has just stuck with me. Leaders create the weather. And it's another one of those quotes where you could say parents create the weather or coaches create the weather. And that has it's vivid. I mean, you've been in contexts where it was always 50 and rainy. That's the weather patterns that individual kind of put out into the world. Or it was stormy and tornadic and hurricane-like for some leaders who are just whirling dervishes running around, and it was always shifting and changing and at the drop of a hat. I mean, you've been in that context. You've also been in contexts where maybe it was just cold. Back to the layoffs. It was cold. You were in Siberia. It was so cold. No relationship, just cold. Or maybe it's hot, that environment where the leader's putting a lot of pressure on. It's like a desert. It's dry and hot. Hopefully, you've been in those situations where the weather patterns being created by the leader or the leadership team, it was, partly cloudy. And there were rays of light shining through. It wasn't all kind of clouds and mist. And sometimes, where do people want to live? Well, in the context of the United States, they want to live in San Diego, where it's 70 and sunny every day. Now, it's unrealistic to think that it's going to be 70 and sunny, but we're talking about climate and weather shifts. It's not always 70 and sunny, but generally speaking, is this a good place to be? Do I want to be here? And so that leaders create the weather is such a fascinating metaphor. It's such a vivid, and it just creates such a wonderful image in my mind. Because to your point, I think, what is weather over time? Climate. What's another word for climate? Well, culture. And what's a simple definition of culture? The way we do things around here. And so how do we do things around here? This is kind of like back to so who are you? And how we do things around here is we make people decisions slowly and thoughtfully and carefully. And when we need to separate from someone, we do it thoughtfully and carefully and with love, quote unquote. We create a space where we can have the difficult conversations. We celebrate small wins and actually celebrate often, because we know that celebration is a critical element of effective leadership. And those rays of light, as we celebrate individual wins or team wins or organizational wins, they create the weather pattern of sunshine. So I love that quote. I absolutely do. And for me, again, it hits home when it's parents create the weather. And I don't know if you're a parent or not, but when my kids wake up, what are the weather patterns? Hey, hope you have an awesome day. I really, really, really love the fact that you worked hard last night and you were studying. You are doing so awesome. Thank you. Have an awesome day. Have a great practice, and we'll connect at dinner. That's a totally different kind of weather pattern than hurry up. Let's go. Let's go. Get going. You're always late. You're always late. God, get on your shoes. Totally different environment, right? And so that intentionality about leaders creating the weather, that it's, you've worked for leaders where we were just talking about the Olympics a little bit ago. They make the most difficult work in the world look easy, just like those Olympians. And it's just done with a sense of grace. And that's always my North Star, because I'm not there yet. I'm not perfect. I haven't figured it all out, but I have worked for some individuals who they were doing some of the most difficult work and doing it with a sense of grace and maintaining just calm waters versus dark and stormy seas.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely with you there. It's like the duck, isn't it? The swimming duck, perfectly serene and calm and motionless above the water, and then underneath it's kicking like mad.
The duck, yeah.
There's exactly that kind of thing, isn't it? Because those leaders who present a picture of calm and collected decision making, I'm sure internally they're going just as nuts as anyone else. They're probably panicking in their own head as well. But it's about what you put out there, isn't it? It's about the weather that you generate.
Yeah.
And I love that you said as well, slightly cloudy with some rays of sunshine, because I was worried you were going to say really sunny all the time.
No.
And nobody wants to work for that either, because that's living in a desert, isn't it?
No, I mean, there's going to be challenges. There's going to be obstacles. There's going to be some rain. Yeah. But generally speaking, is this a place where I'd want to live? And is this a place that is where I can thrive? And I think weather's one component of that, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I really like it. And yeah, I mean, it's impossible, I think, to overestimate the importance and the impact that a good culture can have on a team. Yes. I think that's why this quote is so relevant, so powerful, so useful, something we should keep in mind all the time, really.
Yes. But back to what we were talking a little bit ago about the soundboard metaphor, the kind of clunky metaphor that I'm using here. But I think, is the leader intentionally turning the dials, and is there intentionality behind their behavior? And I think that's incredibly important, that I might need to raise the heat. I might need to hold this person accountable. I might need to let this person go because they've been underperforming, and we've had 3 conversations and this isn't a fit. I get all of that. Yes. But is there intentionality behind the behavior? Or is this an individual who's kind of floating through the day and just, I think of a pinball machine, just bouncing off of all of the different stimuli, and there's little forethought and there's little intentionality in how they're intervening. And I always use the phrase when in the classroom, a skillful intervention. We want our physicians to make a skillful intervention on grandma or grandpa or our parents or us. We want our accountants to make a skillful intervention. We want our lawyers to skillfully intervene. We want our favorite athletes to skillfully intervene, our Olympians. And so we also want our leaders to skillfully and thoughtfully intervene. And maybe our next conversation, we can get into, the challenge at times of, I do a lot of work in construction, and you might have a master carpenter, and then they're elevated to a position of authority, and they're given 0 training now about this whole new job that they have with a very different set of skills, where you're no longer working with maple and pine, you're working with Jenny and Peter. And that's very different. Jenny and
Absolutely.
Peter talk back. Jenny and Peter don't show up. The pine and the maple show up, right?
Yeah.
So no.
No, I've not heard it in the construction industry before, but yeah, it's a very common
Yes.
challenge that one. It comes up a lot. It's even got a name, hasn't it? Accidental managers, and yeah, it comes up a lot. Let's put it that way.
Exactly. And then
there's a reason why, isn't there?
Well, and by gosh, we're going to make sure that master carpenter is certified, and that accountant has their CPA, and that attorney has their JD, and that all of these that automotive tech is certified and can work on the vehicle. But then we put these people in positions of management and leadership, and there's very little training for this new role. And I often will use the analogy of, let's say you put an MBA who knows a thing or two about leadership, and they're in a healthcare organization. And you look at that MBA and you say, okay, we want you to go do healthcare today. You're going to go take care of patients. Well, that individual would hurt and damage people. They'd learn eventually over time how to not hurt and damage people, but they would hurt and damage people. Well, sometimes the opposite is the case, where we have that healthcare worker now put in a position of leadership, and they're leading a team, and they're damaging culture. They're hurting it because they haven't been prepared to do the work. And we see that, as you mentioned, across industry. And I don't know how we fix that. I don't know what we do to bridge that gap, because I think we're killing culture and some of the weather patterns that these people are putting out, because they're challenged with very, very difficult scenarios, and they're doing their best, but they're not prepared, and they don't have the skill.
Yeah. I mean, one way that we could address that, but although I have very few illusions about how this might be taken up by the majority of companies, but I firmly believe it's leadership training early. So regardless of their position in your organization, as soon as anyone joins, part of their onboarding, you get a leadership course, and then you'll have an annual refresher or something like that. Because if you understand leadership from the beginning with the organization, you know what it's supposed to look like, how it works in this company or whatever. As you move up the ranks, you'll understand what you're doing a bit better.
Yeah.
But I think the problem with that is that, and it struck me actually as you were listing those examples, I think all of the ones that you picked, all of those jobs, there's a legal requirement for that training to exist. And that's probably the only reason those businesses are doing it. And I feel like if you didn't have to have a qualification to be a lawyer or a legal check note to be a nurse or something, I don't know what the phraseology is. I've never worked in healthcare, but would they still be doing it? Probably not, I reckon. And that maybe is the answer for leadership training, isn't it? It's not a legal requirement. We don't have to do it, so we're not going to spend the money on it.
Exactly. And we'll hope for the best. And then we wonder why, according to Gallup, and you can look at some numbers from Deloitte or McKinsey, we wonder why the engagement numbers are low. Well, we're putting people in positions of authority who don't have the knowledge or skills, or they're learning them on the job. And I'll tell you one final story, kind of as we begin to wind down. I was doing some work in construction, and some of the senior leaders were kind of commiserating about the foreman and their lack of skill. And I looked at them and I said, what training have we given these individuals? It would seem to me their new job is negotiation, conflict management, problem solving, and building relationships quickly. And again, back to that master carpenter example, this person has all the skills with pine and maple, but we have not prepared this individual for this new role. And we're part of the problem. Actually, we've put this person in a position and not given them the training to be successful. And that was just how it had. That doesn't mean that these leaders are bad people at all. It's just how it's always been done. It's just always been done that we don't train these individuals, that we don't, you have the accountant who becomes the senior partner or the managing partner, or the attorney who becomes the managing partner, or the English professor who becomes the provost. And to your point, yes, we may not invest in those individuals to truly prepare them to do the work. So it's a fun puzzle. It really is, because I think we can make a lot of difference in the world if we better prepared these individuals. And it's also kind of mean to those individuals because you're putting them in a position where we're requiring Olympic level work from them and not giving them the tools to do it in
Absolutely.
some of these cases, right?
Yeah. I mean, you're almost deliberately setting them up to fail, aren't you? And this is why it's one of my great frustrations, because it's so unfair. Like, you're not giving that person, firstly, the chance to succeed, but you're also inflicting an untrained manager on all the people they're leading as well. So that's why engagement suffers, isn't it? Because
like a virus, right? Like
yeah,
a virus,
but you're punishing your workforce effectively with a bad manager. I mean, sometimes they won't be a bad manager, of course. Sometimes you'll get lucky and it just happens they're already good at leadership and it all works out. But if you don't train them, if you don't select on that basis, at least, you've got no real way of knowing that. It's a gamble.
It is.
And you think about it, yeah. I mean, again, I'm sure we've both encountered plenty of those senior leaders who are like, well, I'm an excellent judge of character. I can pick the leader from any group, and that's how I promote people. That's what it's based on, and training's irrelevant and all this kind of thing. And it's just like the arrogance there as well. Yep. And again, it's back to this: the leaders always have to have the answer. They always have to make that snap decision. That's what decisive is. All of these kind of really toxic myths, actually, about what leadership is and how it works and how to get the best from people. And I think, as I said just now, the only way I can think of to solve that is get in at the ground floor, train people early.
Yeah, or some type of external certification that gains traction and that is affordable and that is coveted by individuals in industry. So when you think about some of the sustainability certifications, LEED certifications that, all of a sudden now there's a movement and we want you to have this certification. We want you to, but yes, I mean, and even then you're going to have a certain percentage who get certified, quote unquote, and aren't good. That's truth. That happens with doctors and lawyers and accountants. However, it's a filter, at least, and it's an attempt to better prepare these individuals to do that work. So I don't know. It keeps us as podcasters and scholars and authors and curious individuals busy because it's a fun puzzle. It really is.
You're not wrong. I'm going to start reframing it. I usually refer to it as one of my greatest frustrations, but I like fun puzzle. I think that's a more positive way of looking at it.
It is because there's a huge opportunity here. There's a huge opportunity, but you've brought up a couple of the potential limitations of, are people going to either invest their own money? Are organizations going to invest their money? What would that training look like? And does it happen over a period of time and years? Like, are there continuing education requirements? Because in a lot of those professions, legal, law, accountancy, healthcare, there's continuing education over the course of a career, which is important. And that doesn't exist for management right now.
Yeah, which is weird when you consider like how rapidly the body of thought changes on I mean, leadership, definitely. I mean, it feels like there's a new theory every week, but I'm probably exaggerating that.
No, true.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Anyway, we could talk about that for ages, couldn't we? And maybe we will another time.
Leadership heroes.
Cool. So this is the one that no one can avoid. Everyone gets this question. So
sure,
we have to do this one because it's my favorite.
Good.
So it's called Leadership Heroes. So if you had to pick one person, could be anyone you like though, could be alive, dead, past, present, real, or even fictitious, if you're in that kind of mood, who in your opinion would perfectly embody leadership, who would that person be and why?
So I did a post yesterday, wrote it over the weekend, on a coach from the United States named John Wooden. And he was a basketball coach at UCLA and won 10 NCAA championships over a period of, I believe it was about 13 years. Has an incredible book called Wooden on Leadership. And from this podcast is called Leading with Integrity. By all accounts, just a person of integrity. just an incredible human, an incredible individual who had this very kind of quiet, unassuming, but high standards, high process, but also high care and love for his players. Even those individuals that weren't the superstars felt as if he cared about them as people. And so just a wonderful example of an individual who was working at the highest levels, but he didn't need to yell and scream. He didn't need to, and I juxtapose him with Bobby Knight, who was another coach in the United States who famously threw a chair across a basketball court and just was known as a hothead, and ultimately was fired from his position at Indiana University. So when I think of an individual, I mean, obviously you have all kinds of folks that we could look to who have changed the world, but oftentimes there's kind of this also fatal flaw with some of these individuals. And I haven't found that with Wooden yet. I mean, you have an individual who holistically was working to be the best version of himself. His wife passed away ahead of him, and he wrote a letter to his wife every day, devout in his faith, just really constantly working to be a better version of himself his whole life. And so that is an individual, John Wooden. I would encourage listeners to just explore him as an individual and explore kind of the legacy he left on his players, on the community, and on the sport as just in my mind, a beacon of what a great coach can be. And again, around the world, you have coaches. And if we had a lot more John Woodens, it would be a different world. That's for sure.
Nice. Well, I don't know who he is. Don't really follow sports in general, but certainly not basketball. So,
well,
I'll look him up, and I'll see if I can dig out that book as well, because it does sound interesting.
And David, I don't either. I'm not a huge sports fan, but in my explorations of leaders, I mean, this is an individual who really kind of stands out as, and I think what I value in the story is that lifelong pursuit of being a better version of himself, that Carol Dweck quote, becoming is better than being, and constantly working to be a better version of himself.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, you use the word legacy as well. And that's got to be one of the big tests of any leader, isn't it? Is what happens after they're not there anymore for whatever reason.
Yes.
Does the team carry on? Does the culture persist, etc.?
Yep. Exactly. Exactly.
Awesome. Well, Scott, it's been a true pleasure meeting you and having this conversation today. Thank you so much for your time. One small thing I will ask just at the end is, any of the listeners want to learn more about you, perhaps get in touch, work with you, etc., where can they go to find out more?
So LinkedIn is a great place to find me. So I am Scott J. Allen, and you can find me on LinkedIn. And then scottjallen.net is the website. So you can find me there as well. And any questions, or if I can share resources, please feel free to reach out. Happy to do so.
Perfect. I'll pop both of those links in the episode description so everyone can find it easily. Lovely. Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you for being so generous with your time as well.
Oh, David, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Love the conversation. Anytime, say the word.
Likewise. Yeah, I'm sure we're going to speak again. Cheers.
Okay.
Scott. Have a great rest of your day. Cheers.
Be well.
Well, listener or viewer, thank you so much for being with us today. I hope you found this episode useful, educational, and entertaining, possibly as well. If you would like to learn more about Scott and what he does, I encourage you to click on the links in the episode description, in the show notes below. Go and visit his website, find him on social media, reach out to him, learn more things. Huge thank you to Scott as well for his time today and his conversation and insights. And while you are in the episode description, don't forget to also click on that link, www.leadernotaboss.com. Come and join us at the Integrity Leaders online community for new leaders, first-time business founders, and people who are in a leadership transition, whatever form that may take. This community is there for you. It is there to give you access to leadership resources, a supportive network, me as well. And of course, don't forget the early access to these podcast episodes. Get them the week before anyone else does. And as you are a listener or viewer of the podcast, you can also use a 50% off discount. Use the code halfoff24, and that will give you 50% off forever for as long as you remain a member. No 1 month, no 3 months, no fake Black Friday deal. It is half off forever, 50% off. Join me again next week when I'll be talking to tech leader Greg Williams about his experiences, leadership lessons learned, and more besides. Hope to see you or hear you. Hope you'll see me or hear me then. And until next week, as always, be a leader, not a boss.